Hello, this is my lecture 5 Reasons Why Classical Civilization Matters. First, it shaped the insides of our minds. In many ways, what happened in the 2000 or so years between about 1500 BCE and 500 CE were the most important developments in the entire history of Homo sapiens. It was the world that formed the inside of our heads, scientifically, intellectually, and psychologically, and imaginatively. There have been 6 cultural revolutions in human history. 4, 5, and 6 are all familiar, and few teenagers actually manage to leave school without knowing something about them. That was the printing revolution in the 15th century. There was the Industrial Revolution, and of course our very own digital revolution. I wrote my PhD in 1987 on a manual typewriter, and I could only access ancient texts either by buying them or reading them in libraries. But the internet now continues to open up and transform our societies and our relationships with one another, and of course our educations, simply by providing fundamental new ways of communicating. But what about the first 3 revolutions? The first was the cognitive revolution, which seems to have taken place in Africa, perhaps 70,000 years BCE, when we first stood upright, started talking to each other, and held conversations about things other than what was right in front of our noses, right in front of where we could see at the time. And then Homo erectus gave way to Homo sapiens, and less cognitively advanced archaic humans like the Neanderthals declined and faded away. For tens of thousands of years, these new brainy humans, with their ability to talk abstractly, lived largely by hunting and gathering, nomadic lifestyles. The second revolution was the Neolithic or agricultural revolution, starting in about 10,000 BCE. We started farming arable crops, pulses and fruits intensively, and we built advanced, high-maintenance cities and irrigation systems. We had to find somewhere to live semi-permanently, and we needed cities to do that so that we could look after our food production. Now, this happened in the ancient Middle East, in Mesopotamia, which is approximately modern Iraq. And the Mesopotamian domestication of livestock and their ploughing of fields eventually gave rise to large conurbations, and several important cultural developments took place. These were all required to give tens of thousands of people the glue that would hold them together in a community. And they included fixed laws, governments, and rituals, writing, the mathematics necessary for architectural projects, and culture in the form of stories known across large populations in common. Huge advances were made, and they spread or developed separately across not only Western Asia and North Africa, but also in the Indus Valley and along the Yangtze River. But it was the third revolution, the classical revolution, that kicked off the classical world. And this signifies the intellectual revolution which took place amongst people who spoke Greek, but were in constant interaction with other ethnic groups. This is very important. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Asia Minor, and the Levant and the Nile Delta, and parts of the Black Sea littoral, Greeks were intermarrying with, or borrowing and adapting from, or trading with all these different cultures. The vast intellectual leaps that were to be taken from around the 7th century BCE were all made possible by that intense meeting of ways of life and culture, and advances in fields such as medicine, navigation, and these had already been made to a large degree by the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Luvians, the Lycians, and the Hittites. But within 400 years, the ancient Greeks had come up with a list of innovations and inventions and achievements that still beggars belief. They were then all adapted and further developed by the Romans, especially in poetry, engineering, visual arts, administration, and communications. The miraculous Greek inventions included rational natural science, using empirical observations from which hypotheses were inferred, rational medicine that had absolutely no time for diagnoses involving angry gods or vindictive deities or superstition, rather than intense recording of symptoms. Democracy and the political theory to sustain or critique it arrived. Organised competitive sports, equestrian events, athletics, comic and tragic theatre. This is a new medium where skilled performers impersonated mythical and fictional characters in gorgeous poetry and song. History writing without looking for supernatural explanations or motives came along. Study of the formal techniques of speech making, which became known as rhetoric. The invention of all the main branches of philosophy, the codification of advanced systems of logic, and huge advances in geometry and mathematics, optics, the foundation of the first university and very large research libraries, mechanics, zoology, botany, biography, autobiography, prose fiction, satire. And we need to add to these the shared body of gorgeous, glamorous mythology which glued the wide Greek diaspora together and now, nearly 3,000 years later, still informs the shared imagination not only of the direct cultural descendants of the ancient Greeks and the Romans, but of the whole planet. The Odyssey and Aesop's fables are read in almost every language of the world. The second reason is that the ancient Greeks and Romans provide us with a great civilization that failed, but that we can talk to. We live in what sometimes feel like apocalyptic times. We're grappling with global pandemics, we're facing ecological disaster, we're watching democracies being undermined in some nations and in others the rise of theocracies that is ruled by religious rather than secular authorities and values. It really is more than ever important to hang on to the Enlightenment values and reasoned debate which characterise the very best of all the ancient world's communities. The different types of discourse they had are still useful. But that ancient society, with its paradoxical blend of belief in many gods and advanced non-religious study of human flourishing in its philosophical schools, ultimately failed. The triumph of Christianity meant the end of at least 2,000 years of pagan Greek culture and of at least 1,000 of the pagan Roman world. Now, the reasons for that, this great religious change, are very, very complicated. But the important and wonderful thing is that the pre-Christian Greeks and Romans, whose colourful, intellectually advanced, often joyous, and in some ways surprisingly tolerant world just disappeared. And that was between about 300 and 500 CE. But it left behind hundreds of books we can read, archaeological sites we can visit, and artworks we can feast our eyes on. Most, if still not quite all, of those writings have been translated into modern languages and accessible free online to anyone who can read. And we can use them to illuminate almost all the burning questions that are facing us today. Why did the classical world, with all its talk of liberty, fail to abolish slavery as a system? Did this contribute to the whole failure of the classical world to survive? How did the Greeks and Romans think about ethnic difference, what we call race? Is it true that it was culture, so education, civic status, deportment, behaviour, that defined a Greek or Roman rather than skin colour or other aspect of biology or appearance? What did ancient religion, with all its wonderful variety of female goddesses, offer women that they often struggle to get from Christianity, Judaism or Islam today? Is it true that there was no idea of a fixed, normal sexuality in ancient Greece and Rome, and that those societies were actually far more tolerant and easygoing when it came to different types of relationship? Did the ancients realise that humans could permanently harm the environment? The answer to that one is yes. How did they behave in times of epidemics? How did they treat their children? What different views on the true sources of human well-being and happiness did all those different philosophical schools hold? Can they help us today? Which rulers succeeded in maintaining power for long? And how on earth did they do it and why? The availability of a culture both very like our own in some ways and very different to debate these questions with is an invaluable asset and an astonishing privilege. The third reason is that it makes you think comparatively and realise that change is possible. The demise of the ancient world leaves us with a warning and an example of what can happen if a civilization or a whole set of cultural formations gets too large, too divided, too decadent, or just too resistant to reform, and then it collapses altogether. Looking at ancient maps, on the other hand, shows how geopolitical systems can shift drastically and change. And so today's nation state or confederacy or military alliance will not last forever either. Antiquity also gave us comparative anthropology and ethnography. The histories of Herodotus, which point out the massive cultural differences between ways of life amongst the Greeks, the Persians, the Egyptians, the Thracians, the Scythians, all of that forces the reader to ask whether there is any single correct way of life or whether everything is in fact culturally relative and culturally specific. But antiquity also gave us the art of utopian thinking. If we're to be able to create a better society, or at least reform our current society in ways that will make it more enjoyable for everyone and we can all flourish in sustainable ways, we need to be able to imagine it first. There is already utopian thinking in the Odyssey. Homer describes the idyllic society of the island of Phaeacia, where food grows in abundance without any need for human labour or agricultural work. Even the ships have their own mind, a sort of artificial intelligence, and can steer themselves. Aristophanes' comedies depict the transformations of Athenian society after heroic interventions by citizen saviours, both male and female, and the eradication of poverty. But it was with Plato's Republic and Aristotle's response to it in his Politics, followed by other political philosophers in antiquity, that whole societies were designed in the imagination with the hope of maximising human flourishing. Our media are currently filled with dystopian scenarios, from I, Robot and The Handmaid's Tale, the Book of Eli to Hunger Games. Perhaps we feel too crushed and cynical by the events of the last few years and the increasingly obvious heating up of the planet, even to think about possible utopias anymore. So the antidote is to consult the classical utopians and practice thinking about how happy humans could be if we just got our collective act together. The fourth reason is that analytical and critical skills and cultural literacy are all imbued by thinking about classical antiquity. It's remarkably good for mental agility at any age. It of course teaches cultural literacy, understanding the key significance of certain events and figures in history and literature. It is important to know who Pericles was and why the Battle of Actium determined that the centre of the Roman Empire was to be in Italy rather than Egypt. But the ancient world also offers us a magnificent training in source evaluation, interrogating the reliability and authority of evidence and propaganda and different kinds of information. This leaves us in a much better position to respond critically to sources of news and information today and choose who to believe and who should lead us and what are the best policies. It enables us to perform critical comparisons of competing authorities in a very complex society: religion, rulers, the press, science, philosophical inquiry. The ancients were absolute masters both of the practice and theory of communication. Through their writings and their artworks and their public architecture, we can really come to understand far better how to articulate arguments, and familiarity with great ancient speeches and speech-making and persuasive communication is surely the bedrock of effective communication today. By being able to look at one phenomenon in a society from the angle of different kinds of source allows us to read a civilization in the round. At the moment, for example, I've been researching the great Athenian navy of the classical democratic period, Now, Plato hated the navy politically, whereas Aristophanes, the comic poet, courted the seamen with flattering joke sequences. But the fleet was mysteriously left out of the art of the Acropolis. Why? The level of sophistication of ancient thought also stretches our intellectual muscles intensively. It enriches our discussion of the early development of ideas that still preoccupy us all. Ideas about truth, time, beauty, censorship, civic harmony, the nature of existence, the possibility of divinity, and the shape of the universe. But the fifth reason is that classical civilization is uplifting. Now, I've been talking a lot about how useful it is and how contact with the classical world can make us cleverer, more analytical, and more enlightened citizens. Classics is useful, but it's also so full of beauty and wonder and can be so pleasurable and inspiring. It makes us feel part of a great human adventure that really must continue, and with effort and cooperation allow us to create increasing well-being for all the inhabitants of the planet, the entire natural and animal worlds, as well as human society. But the purple patches of ancient literature and art are just so aesthetically beautiful that it's really no wonder that they've inspired every single generation subsequently that got contact with them, especially since the Renaissance and the amazing rescue of almost all of ancient Greek literature from the libraries of Byzantium. The last 300 years have also seen really breathtaking excavations of ancient archaeological sites and the recovery of a very large number of pieces of ancient art. So part of the story of the classics I want to explore in these lectures is the impact that they've had on later societies. And I'll be asking why, for example, Myron's famous statue of a discus thrower was so revolutionary. But I'll also want to know why and how it's been used and abused, not just by sculptors, but by politicians, statesmen, propagandists. I will be asking what Plutarch did to improve the literary genre of biography, but also how his heroes like Spartacus and Brutus have inspired republicans, abolitionists, and social justice campaigners. I'll analyse the really complicated gender politics of a lot of ancient Greek tragedy, such as the Medea, but also the cultural politics of all the different interpretations on modern stages by star actors of those incredible plays. Now, these lectures will be coming out whenever I've got time to talk to one to camera in the spare bedroom of my family's home in Cambridgeshire. They'll vary in length and in the extent of the visual material that accompanies them. They'll usually be far more. I'm going to divide them into 5 basic groups. That's history, philosophy, literature, material culture, and the reception of antiquity in the modern world. Some of them will be directly related to the curriculum of British secondary education's GCSE and A-levels in classical civilization and ancient history. But what I really hope is that most of them can also be listened as podcasts and by anybody with a general interest in the ancient world. But the fundamental principle underlying all of them is simply this. With the recent privatisation of universities in Britain and elsewhere, and the erosion of adult educational organisations, talks on really important academic subjects like classics are becoming increasingly expensive, inaccessible, and indeed exclusionary. The least I can do is make all the lectures I've ever written for the last 30 years for small groups of students in individual universities and schools and colleges, make those available to anyone who can access the internet. I also hope to persuade other colleagues and committed classicists to make lectures in a guest format that can be available on this channel. But above all, I want to make it truly a people's classics channel, and I really hope you'll be joining me. Thank you.